about China, and then we will bring you all in as members of the audience for your questions and your comments subsequently. But Mike Pillsbury is a really remarkable person who's had a huge role in U.S. foreign policy. Take this the right way, Mike, a little like Zelig. He has been everywhere at key moments and played crucial roles as a Senate staffer in writing the legislation to create the U.S. Institute of Peace, the National Endowment for Democracy. He has played particularly crucial roles on policy related to Afghanistan and China, as you'll hear out of his own mouth. Much of his thinking about China earlier in his career was as an advocate for developing a strategic relationship with China as a counterbalance to the Soviets. He has, over time, in particular in a role in recent years, working for the famed Andy Marshall in the Office of Net Assessment and the Department of Defense, been one of the most senior thinkers about China and its strategy, and he has had remarkable access to people in China, particularly in the military and among strategic thinkers, to come to understand what they really think. And in his most recent work as director of the Center for Chinese Strategies at the Hudson Institute, he's continued a pattern of translating some of the most interesting strategic thinking documents in China so that our policy community and our general public can have a better understanding of what it is that China intends to do.
Can I put it there?
Sure, feel free.
Sorry.
Feel free. Mike has played many roles, including Assistant Undersecretary of Defense for Policy Planning, was crucial in roles at 4 Senate committees, and as I said, more recently has played this crucial role working for Andy Marshall at the Office of Net Assessment. Let's begin, if I may, by just asking you, what is it that led you to change your basic perspective about China's rise and whether it was helpful or harmful to the United States as a strategic matter? Because your book is a story of a changed perspective on your part. How did that come about?
Well, there were several moments, not all one time. I think the first moment was 1989, the surprise of the Tiananmen. The surprise of the Tiananmen incident was the first moment. The second moment was really 10 years later, the B-2 bombing, when we got the minutes of the Politburo meeting, just a few hours after the bombing. John Zeman called together the Politburo Standing Committee, and not one member said, maybe this is an accident. Let's look into it. The comments of all the members were almost outbidding each other for how tough they could be on the Americans. Li Peng, John Zeman, several of them said, this is a test. Americans, this B-2 bombing of our embassy is a test, and now we must respond so the Americans know they can't push us around. Then there was another incident later on by 2004, 2005, when a number of defectors had come out from China, high-level defectors, who explained, you might say, just how smart China was at manipulating the American political system. Because people like me, and I could explain what that means, but people like me tend to be very arrogant about America. We are the superpower because we're smarter than other countries, or because God helps us and doesn't help the other countries. There's a series of reasons why we are the #1 country in the world. And slowly over time, I began to realize, no, that's not the case. China is smarter than us. The Chinese strategy, or their way of strategic thinking, is smarter than us. And not for all time. Go back and read Bob Kagan's book, Dangerous Nation. There's a number of books about the American founding fathers, even the Pilgrims. I have an ancestor who was a pilgrim, 1640, Massachusetts Bay Colony. There's a book about how the Pilgrims figured out the geopolitics of the Indian tribes. And they backed a winning Indian tribe against the others. It's the way White Thanksgiving takes place in 1621. If you read a number of books about why didn't Spain keep the Mississippi River in 1780, Bob Kagan and others show this really remarkable geopolitical scheming that goes on. There's no better word for it than scheming by founding fathers and pilgrims. But slowly over time, we fast forward to Woodrow Wilson. And all of a sudden, we're going to have world order and democracy. And you fast forward to today, and it's as though we've lost whatever capacity we had to be sensitive, geopolitically smart, understand what to do. All that seems to be gone. Whereas in China, they have, as one person joked, they had a few bad centuries. Maybe several hundred bad centuries. But if you go back to when my ancestor came in 1640, China was just ending the Ming Dynasty. The Qing is beginning. That's when the bad centuries start to happen. They do expand. They become double or triple their size. But seen over a period of several hundred years, the case for Chinese strategy being smarter, I think, is very strong. And that's one thing I try to show in the book. Not only were people like me wrong and slowly woke up, but we woke up to respect and admiration for the quality of Chinese strategy. Didn't happen all at once, in other words.
So, help explain for those here who haven't read the book, what the major takeaways are that build on this general sense that people have that Chinese leaders are patient and that the booming economy will give them an enormous lift as a global power. What is it that's the will and skill that's being applied by the Chinese leadership? What is the content of this strategy which goes beyond patience in the long term and economic growth?
Well, the key concept for the Chinese goes back to about 1000 BC. A guy known colloquially as Zhang Taigung, Duke, I call him Duke Ginger. He writes a text about how to manipulate your opponent. And some of his themes are picked up by Sun Tzu, Art of War, another 500 years later. Everybody in China knows this concept. You try to find out what your opponent, the wishful thinking your opponent has about you. Gesundheit, who has got the... Try to find out what your opponent's wishful thinking is about you that you most want to strengthen his or her wishful thinking because it will serve your purpose. And to do that, you need really good intelligence. You can't just put your thumb up in the air and, think about it. You need extremely good intelligence. And some of the defectors told us they actually gathered this intelligence about Washington, D.C. What is the American belief about China's future that's best for China? And how can we nurture that belief and nurture those Americans? And then the opposite. What is worse for us? What is the worst for China's national security interest that the Americans are trying to do? How can we neutralize those people or deny them a voice? And one of the defectors had a lot of stories to tell about 1993 when they identified Nancy Pelosi and George Mitchell, Winston Lord, probably in the beginning President Clinton, as having really dangerous thinking about China. Nancy Pelosi and George Mitchell had a bill that passed both houses, putting very strong demands on China, the political reform. Freedom House sort of dream come true reforms were to be required. And President Clinton, in the peak of American efforts to ever bring democracy to China, in May of 1993, President Clinton hosted a reception in the White House, never to happen again. Never to happen again. Should be a goal of Freedom House, to have a president do this again. Inviting dissidents, inviting a Dalai Lama representative, inviting people from the Tiananmen leadership, with members of Congress, sort of lionizing the way Solzhenitsyn, it's a famous Kissinger issue, should have been and eventually was. Okay, the Chinese panicked at that. They had a debate, one defector tells us, which we could call jokingly the Who Lost America debate. How did this happen? And they began to take actions within a year that turned the situation around.
Remarkable, the Clinton administration.
And it left the Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia, Winston Lord, deeply embarrassed. And many speculated he would resign. Because at his confirmation hearing, he said, we must place strict conditions on China, democracy and human rights, or they will not be given most favored nation status treatment. And a series of other things. So no more goodies unless they meet these strict demands. The president has supported that during the campaign. Remember the coddling the butchers of Beijing, blaming Father Bush? All that's reversed within 9 months. Winston Lord does not resign. He makes the best of it that he can. Radio Free Asia almost got canceled during this period. You mentioned my work on the National Endowment for Democracy and the U.S. Institute of Peace. A really big fight in the Congress was between Father Bush's administration and the Congress over Radio Free Asia, especially the Mandarin part. Nobody cared about North Korean broadcasts or, broadcasts to Myanmar. But the State Department told us we will veto this. President Bush will veto Radio Free Asia. This is 1992. And a coalition was formed, I'll never forget it. Jesse Helms and Orrin Hatch were on one side of the co-sponsor letter. On the other side was Joe Biden and Claiborne Pell. So and I walked this letter around the Senate floor. And as you know from your own experience, as soon as senators see, oh my God, Joe Biden and Claiborne Pell and Teddy Kennedy want this, and Jesse Helms, Orrin Hatch, and strong conservatives want it, and we pretty soon had 60 senators sign up, about 3 days. We heard from the administration, we're still going to veto it. So we had to form a commission on whether or not to create Radio Free Asia. Winston Lord testified to it. Bill Clinton came out in his first speech as a candidate, Georgetown University. We need Radio Free Asia, butchers of Beijing. Within a year and a half, that's all turned around. Now, did something big happen in China? No. They very craftily, with strategic thinking, rather than panic, they asked themselves a very famous strategic question that Mao Zedong first raised. Everybody in China still know this. If I asked you now, Mark, do you know Mao's essay on strategy for the revolution, 1936? You're supposed to say yes. I say, Mark, what's the most important first sentence? 谁是我们的敌人,谁是我们的朋友? Who are friends? Who are enemies? Mao parses everybody according to different subsectors. Who do we bring over? Who do we cold shoulder? They're hopeless. They did that, this defector was telling us, they did that to the American political system. And they succeeded brilliantly. And things have never been the same.
One of your themes in the book is that some of our misunderstanding or failure to understand or willful refusal to understand has to do with the lack of transparency of the political system. And I'll soon want to bring Sarah into this discussion of the relationship between China's geopolitical rise and the nature of governance at home. But elaborate on that point a bit, or turn to Sarah, on how the lack of transparency in the political system in China is not only
basically considered to be okay. There's nothing illegal about it. But there's an implied reciprocity, that if you can do this to us and turn our American president around, sure, we'd like to do that in Beijing. We'd like to be able to operate, our government would like to be able to operate in Beijing to turn things around that we don't like. But Chinese secrecy is in part designed to prevent that from happening. It's very hard to know who's who. This reporter who you mentioned a few days ago in your press comment, Gao Yu, who released the 9 don't talk about, as they called it, the 9 points. That's the allegation against her. That is that should have been public at the time. But if we don't know the players, we don't know who's Nancy Pelosi, who's George Mitchell, and that group that the Chinese could easily learn about, 1993. They knew the other group. They knew the rules of the game. We can't do that because of Chinese transparency. And in fact, they go beyond transparency to a kind of paranoia about Freedom House, the democracy movement in America, in a 90-minute video that's still online called Jiao Liang Wu Sheng, Silent Contest is a rough translation. For 90 minutes, various Chinese generals come out and warn the public, especially party members. The Americans are trying to overthrow the Communist Party in China. They have all these programs, and they list the programs. It's Orange Revolution all over again. It's happening now, and we must be on alert against this massive American government effort to overthrow our Communist Party. None of it's true, or it's an exaggeration of about 1,000% from what is actually happening. And that, I would argue, helps them sustain the claim for no transparency, for secretiveness.
Let me bring in Sarah here. I know you enjoyed the book, we've chatted about it, but having been the principal author of a number of studies for Freedom House, including how Chinese media censorship is in fact a problem spreading into the world, and most recently in the Politburo's predicament, looking at how the centralization of power under Xi Jinping is a sort of double-edged sword for the CCP hanging on to power. I'd like to ask you about the relationship between the internal governance in China and its foreign policy. Reading this book, how do you see the connection between the two as I was talking to
What struck me about the book is that as someone who's has a lot of expertise on how the internal news and information control system works, as well as the propaganda and just the extent to which deception is used internally in a lot of ways to manipulate public opinion inside China. And it's not just censorship, it's also a lot of these types of 50-cent party members, people putting in pro-government comments, pretending to look like ordinary internet users, as well as issues of transparency, but also just honestly the sheer ruthlessness with which the Chinese Communist Party will go after people who are perceived to be its enemies. It struck me that people looking at U.S.-China relations or at foreign policy and the way the Chinese Communist Party conducts foreign policy would have some kind of assumption that they would behave differently externally. And I think what's very valuable about Mike's book is, in fact, he demonstrates that that's not the case. That the strategic thinking, the approach, the messaging, the manipulation, there's actually a lot of similarities between how it's done externally and how it's done internally. And then, for instance, also how those intersect when you see the analysis, for instance, of how textbooks in China are talking about the anti-Americanism, how textbooks in China, what they're actually teaching to Chinese students about the United States, that I think demonstrates, again, this intersection. And so that was one of the things that really struck me, and I think that it's hard to imagine that a leadership that that behaves in the way that you see the Chinese leadership and the Communist Party operating domestically in China would act as, you know, an honest partner and an ally for the United States on some of the different strategic issues that, to be honest, are often used in policy circles to excuse the reason why the United States does not do more to push the Chinese government to reform for resistance, to open the media. So that was one of the points that kind of struck me in terms of that parallel between the domestic tactics and methods being used and those that are being used internationally.
Let's do a thought experiment. I mean, there was a time when people, particularly in the business community, made the case that if China got permanent normal trade relations and we, the West, the United States, the business community engaged China, that ultimately that economic engagement would lead to economic liberalization, which inevitably would lead to political liberalization. It is a little hard to imagine that that's necessarily the case. It seems that the Chinese government has found a formula, at least for the time being, for keeping a grip on power despite having big economic growth. But let's imagine that there was democratization in China. Would it be less of a concern as a rising power? Is the nature of the regime, of the domestic government, something that has an impact on how much the United States should be concerned about China's rise in this 100-year marathon?
I think so. I mean, I think it's really, and it's an interesting question because there are certain places where you have to be very careful not to conflate the CCP and the leadership and the authoritarian regime with China itself. And you know, if you think about what it would look like to have a country like Taiwan that was a global superpower, or even if you're thinking about the U.S. relationship with India, obviously there are, or Indonesia, there are reasons why there's always going to be disagreements and there's going to be strategic contestation. But if we're talking about some of the underlying values, some of these issues of transparency, some of the ways in which we might be able to influence what's happening in China, who some of the actors are. I mean, wouldn't it be great to have some of our counterlocutors and our counterparts on the Chinese side to be some of the individuals and the internal, you know, the lawyers and the journalists, people like Gao Yu, people like Gao Zhichang, people like Xu Zhiyong, people like Hu Zhiqiang, the very people who are now some of the people that under Xi Jinping have been rounded up. I mean, to have those voices from civil society, and let alone an opportunity for some of those kinds of people, like Xu Zhiyong, who's now in prison, he had actually been a representative of local people's Congress. He had actually been elected by people as an independent for a very local level of governance. Now, what if there were a system where someone like that was able to, you know, to rise up through the ranks and have more influence in China? To me, it would seem that we'd be talking about a very different kind of relationship and a very different. I think there would be a lot more opportunity for real partnership and a lot less concern about things like, you know, censorship from China affecting media outlets around the world.
I'm going to let you reclaim your time here with one more question before we go to our audience. In the same territory that I asked about, how will things look differently in 2049 if the CCP hangs on to power and a scenario of China's rise in the world with a different kind of freer form of governance? Why should people be concerned about Freedom House's agenda? Because I actually think one interesting thing about our organization is it's an organization that's focused on human rights and democratization, but we understand the implications for geopolitics too.
Well, Sarah's report is just excellent. The Politburo's predicament. It's very, very sophisticated and describes a lot of the techniques that are used, as I say, in 100-year marathon. They begin the influence operations against Washington, D.C. They begin at home with their own people. So so Ai Weiwei got in trouble because he was the first to reveal in his usual impish way that there's an army of people who are steering internet discussion and the equivalent of Twitter commentary away from sensitive issues and toward proper issues. Now, for us to counter that, we would have to have a vision of 2049 with what I call an unreformed Chinese Communist Party. That is today's Chinese Communist Party. You project it forward. No reforms, no Freedom House agenda takes place. And what would the Americans in 2049 say about us back in 2015 when that happens? They're going to say, why didn't you people do anything? Why was it such a low profile issue? Fight ISIS, save Yemen, have the Palestinian Authority reduce corruption and have some sort of agreement on 2 states. These are the big headline stories. Reforming the Chinese Communist government's policy toward its own people and toward us, I would say is about priority number 100, maybe even priority number 200 for our national political system. And part of the reason for that is what you alluded to earlier, Mark, the wishful thinking. Surely as they get richer, they're going to want to have more responsive governance. But secondly is a failure to examine what will China look like if trends continue. And there, one of the most interesting voices is Hank Paulson. He has a new book. I was watching him on Fareed Zakaria yesterday. Fareed Zakaria asks him twice, does China want to become #1? Very sensitive question. That's the heart of 100-Year Marathon. China's wanted to become #1 and thought it was their duty since Mao, 1955, some would say since the Tang Dynasty. Hank Paulson did everything he could to not answer the question. And then he begins to bring up what I call theme 2. You find this a lot in our media. Theme 2 is, oh, the poor Chinese are running out of water, cancer, pollution, deflation, the growth rate. And you start feeling sorry. There was a television program a couple days ago where the guy said, we really have to help China avoid collapse. So the scenario you're asking about, which is what I spent a long chapter on with 100 footnotes, what will China look like in 2049 if they overcome all these challenges economically, but they don't change politically? The book is not designed to give Pillsbury's opinions. It's got 70 pages of footnotes, 2,000 references. It's come out, the audio version's come out recently, it's on a CD. It takes 20 hours to read the text, but it doesn't cover the footnotes. Massive amount of evidence in here. What have we been doing? What did President Reagan sign off on a secret policy toward China to make China strong? Never changed since 1984. All that's in the chapter. What the Chinese Communist Party thinks is happening. 2 more chapters. But I can't get people to read all this if they have a prefixed view. China's going to collapse, and as they get wealthier, they're going to become a democracy. Those are the 2 items of faith
Jim Mann's
that nobody can overcome.
marvelous lean book, the China Man's. It would suggest that there's
Absolutely.
2 scenarios, but there is another scenario, and that scenario is that they succeed economically and they don't change politically.
And our clue is, what are the Chinese afraid of? I have a chapter on what are China's fears, especially about America. One of the fears is the U.S. Congress. That gives us a clue. It gives Freedom House a clue. They think the U.S. Congress right now is pretty much on their side. And they will slap down individual senators and congressmen if something bad happens. But generally speaking, the U.S. Congress, one of my recommendations in the last chapter is, why doesn't Congress just demand an inventory of all the things the executive branch has been doing to help China? To help China. And I give a clue as to what some of these things are. It's never gone through Congress. There's no China Assistance Act. In fact, Jesse Helms used to block USAID setting up an office in China. They got around it with a place in Furen in Shanghai to set up a small library. It's just a symbolic thing. If we have no concept of what we've been doing to help China, we can't fight the anti-American ideological attack on us. We don't know our leverage. It's very elementary. So there's some hope. I've been hearing from members of Congress, yes, they'd like to do that. They'd like to see what has been going on.
There's a certain degree to which we, certain politicians, certain people in, the private sector have corrupted themselves to become, part of have a stake in that.
The other thing is in South Africa, as you know, American businesses, the Sullivan Code, Sullivan Principles, American business is something else the Chinese are afraid of. So far, American business has almost no pressure on it. There's certainly no legislation that says you must follow all American domestic laws when you operate in China. No one's proposed that yet. There's a whole series of things which could be done by the US Congress, but only if they get away from this notion. Automatic democracy is coming. Probably get away from the notion also of the Chinese hurt feelings. It's how you've hurt the feelings of 1 billion Chinese people, or indicting 5 PLA officers. Well, as long as that remains our national narrative, as long as older people of my generation are never going to change, by the way. You get this from Thomas Kuhn's book on paradigms in science. The old generation has to die off. It's the younger people who have to read this book and many others. Jim Mann's books are very much like this, both of his About Face and China Fantasy, Sarah's report. There's a lot of things young people can read. I work with a lot of young officers in the Pentagon. Their mind is blank on China. They have no idea. They start reading articles, oh my goodness, South China Sea, they're fortifying this air base. And they'll say, why? I don't understand. I thought China was our friend, and they like us. And slowly through the exchange program, when Chinese officers are rude or secretive to American officers, they don't understand. Because what they've been taught in school is China's our friend, and we must make China strong. So this book and many others is trying to change the younger generation's point of view. Because I think for people over about 60, it's too late.
I welcome questions. We have a microphone which we can pass around and ask you to identify yourself and make a brief question. So, please. Thank you for circulating the mic.
I'm Nadia Chao with the City Times. First of all, thank you for giving the people below 60 still have a chance to change.
Well, what's that name?
I wonder, after your books was published, what's the major comments from people, one from the China side and also from the U.S. academia debate? Do you think your message get across? And David Shambo, your good friend, had a very opposite prediction about China's future in his recent article. What do you think? On the one hand, you think believe China is so smart, but David seems to predict China is collapsing based on his long-term research and contact with China. Thank you.
Well, the overall reaction to the book has been good. I'm very flattered. Newsweek had a 3-page review. 3 pages is a lot for Newsweek magazine to review a book. And the Newsweek author lives in China for the last 9 years, and he describes all the main points and some of the evidence of the book. There was a Christian Science Monitor book review, very detailed. There was a Foreign Affairs Council on Foreign Relations book review by Andy Nathan. There was a very good Wall Street Journal review. Had one negative sentence, but almost all the review, is really positive. So, PBS NewsHour interview with Margaret Warner on the thesis of the book. A lot of radio shows. When you're on a radio show with an audience of 3 million people, you can see the sales go up on Amazon within a few hours. So the message that American strategy has been secret and is described in many footnotes here, that's getting through. People did not know about the various national security directives different presidents have signed from the 70s on to help China become strong. That surprised a lot of reviewers. To unconditionally help China. People didn't know the story of Nancy Pelosi, who was a hero at the time. She was doing the best she could do, and the huge majorities in the House and Senate, and then how that was turned around. People don't know the story in here of the hawks, the rise of the hawks in China. Several reviewers have mentioned, I haven't heard about these hawks. I've only heard the foreign ministry, the various China white papers that are put out. I didn't know about these people. I didn't know the hawks in China are so important. I didn't know their program. A number of the reviews have said, I didn't know China has textbooks that tell about how Abraham Lincoln and before him President John Tyler in 1840 wanted to contain China. I didn't know Chinese official textbooks are demonizing America for trying to block China's rise for 150 years. Lots of quotations in here from these books. So another surprise was the World Bank. Some people have commented about the World Bank. I didn't know the World Bank was behind the state-owned enterprises of China becoming stronger. I thought the World Bank was for private companies and free market. I had no idea the World Bank was following all these programs. And I have 40 footnotes to World Bank reports. I didn't know that Hank Paulson and Goldman Sachs, one reviewer said, showed the Chinese how to take their state-owned enterprises run by Communist Party Central Committee appointees and float them, as they say, on Wall Street in Hong Kong. Because the narrative used to be, back 20 years ago, China's collapsing. China's collapsing soon because these state-owned enterprises are just dinosaurs. They can't make a profit. They're going to run China into the ground. Part of their freedom will be economic freedom. People don't know the whole chapter on the capitalism in China. Only 50% of the economy is free market. What's the other half? Receiving cyber espionage products from the government to help the state-owned enterprises. People told me in meetings, I didn't know China had 120 national champions. I didn't know the Forbes 500 biggest corporations in the world used to have 0 Chinese companies. Now it has 90. I didn't know China had 150 billionaires.
Mike, let's bring in some other people.
So that's some of the reaction. I think the reaction is just surprise at the evidence. Because this is an insider revealing things. It's not Sui-Bian's Xiediga, Ikijija.
Jeff,
About that David Shambles.
you
You
want
wanna
to speak to
comment?
it? I would
Well,
like to bring other people in.
Sure, but David Shambaugh has a very simple argument. I read his article 3 times. Wall Street Journal gave it enormous prominence, 2 pages, in color, picture of Xi Jinping. So they must like it. His argument is very simple. Xi Jinping is a bad guy. Xi Jinping's policies and crackdown, Shambaugh says, are going to cause the end of the Communist Party of China. He demonizes Xi Jinping personally. Then he says, I, David Shambaugh, learned this in the past year by going to Central Committee Party School meetings, Zhang Xinhong kinds of meetings. These people told me Xi Jinping's a bad guy. David Shambaugh wrote a book 5 years ago. Communist Party is adapting itself. It's going to last forever. It will never collapse. It's a book. He's very famous for that theory, the adaptation successfully of Chinese Communist Party. 5 years later, he says one person is bringing about the collapse. The end days or end time has begun of the Chinese Communist Party. Why? Because it's a bad party? No, Xi Jinping. So now all of us in the China field are watching to see how is David Shanbao going to be treated. If he's invited back to China a lot, they all say, oh, thank you, David, you know, you're a good friend of China. That means Xi Jinping is so weak. He's so weak. Someone demonizes him as causing the collapse of the Communist Party. And he gets away with it. So we're all waiting to see what happens. Who did David talk to? Oh, he says he was in China twice last year, and he learned this terrible stuff about China's leader. Worse than this, frankly. You talked about Xi cracking down. Here's a famous friend of China in the past, reversing himself.
They've been checking his agenda from those two trips, right? Just right.
My name is Jeffrey Harris. I'm an official of the European Parliament. I'm based in Washington, but over the years I have attempted through the European Parliament as official to raise issues of human rights, political reform, far less than even infinitesimally compared with you.
Now, let's not be too self-effacing.
I've discussed with officials and people from China on these subjects, and obviously what you've done is a very original and fantastic piece of work. I wonder if I could bring you up to date, because I mean, there is a kind of strategy towards China now. There was supposedly a pivot to Asia, and of course a lot of the discourse in these days, early days, about the Trans-Pacific Partnership, geoeconomics of trade policy, or as a critic would say, the weaponization of trade policy, is seen actually to be following a much more cautious approach towards China. How would you assess that? Or do you think it's a good idea to reassess trade policies for China, or is it better to bring them in, and both the structures as in the classic approach?
Anytime that Sarah wants to pop in on a question, she feel free to join in also.
No, these are, it's a short answer, these are all good things. Trans-Pacific Partnership, pivot to Asia. I say in the book, the one department of our government that has China policy right is the Defense Department. Most of the pivot to Asia is the Pentagon rebalance. That's a good thing. It has the Chinese attention. They don't like the rebalance to Asia. And they want to be reassured that the pivot is not about them. And no matter how much we, no matter how much we tell them it's not about China, they don't seem to believe us. But I'm quite up to date about US-China strategy. The problem has been Europe. The Europeans don't get it. They tried to raise the EU arms embargo several times, different members, different heads of state. One by one, they get knocked back down by their colleagues. But the European Union really needs to improve its knowledge of China. It breaks my heart to see these efforts over the last 10 years. To say, oh, China's progress in human rights has been so great, we can lift this European Union arms embargo. That's so sad.
That's not a view found among European parliamentarians, who are a wonderful voice for basic universal values in the world. But you are right about other elements of European Union leadership and business. Did you want to comment on this?
I wanted to just touch on I think you mentioned this reference to this question of this idea of constructive engagement. And I think it seems to me one of the issues that challenges we've had in US policy comes on this question of unconditional engagement, or finding kind of points of leverage and actually having, a strategy and thinking through. I mean, they're playing hardball with us, as you described so well. So we should be really careful about conceding, particularly potential points of leverage, but also in terms of even granting certain access, certain elements of trade relations, so that, and it doesn't necessarily, in some cases it might be a matter of, well, how do you condition, a particular trade agreement with regards to a broad swath of, say, reform in China, which would be one approach. But I think what's disconcerting is that increasingly you have this intersection between elements of freedom of expression, rule of law, transparency, that relate very, very directly to trade. And that there is not a more strategic view towards how do we, you know, in trade agreements and discussions about technology, how do we actually guarantee that U.S. companies have market access? How do we ensure that you know, that there's a degree of transparency and rule of law in the handling of state secret legislation, so that American employees and American citizens don't get caught up in that because they've shared information that in another country would be considered legitimate business intelligence, and in China, they can, you know, there have been cases of people being sent to prison for that. So I think, and to me, looking at some of these strategic questions, the extent that there can be a re-envisioning and a more creative attempt to really engage constructively in the sense of particularly the issues that Freedom House cares about in these broader governance issues, as opposed to the constructive part being kind of an unconditional relationship of friendliness, perhaps, with the Chinese leadership and with the Chinese Communist Party. Because in the long term, it's really with the Chinese people and with these, that is who the relationship should be with.
Other questions?
Thank you. Congratulations, Mr. Pillsbury. This is really a timely wake-up call to American policy makers, including those think tank Greek thought leaders. They've been so wrong for so long. I'm no expert in this field, but I can tell, I endorse this from my personal experience. I was born in China, I grew up there, I educated and worked there until I was 40. So I experienced everything here. Of course there is a secret strategy. Every country should have that if you want to exist on this earth. So I'm not surprised at all. The thing is, what surprised me is the U.S. government officials has been turning a blind eye to the fact that they support the Chinese government. And not only...
Because we think we're smarter.
Well, I don't know,
than China.
but let me put the simple fact. And when Richard Nixon visited China, and then when you establish the relations, when you give the communist regime a permanent membership at the UN Security Council, you recognize its legitimacy, even though it's never people-elected government. And then after 1989, there is an embargo or whatever, sanction, and then you secretly court the Chinese regime and try to lift it as soon as possible. And you give this WTO membership, so you have blood and technology, capital, everything that needed by the Chinese regime to boost its economy. Now you see what we are. You have your allies, against your will, join the Asia Infrastructure Development Bank. That's what happened now. And now you are struggling to find what's wrong with us. It's your own fault, folks. You should wake up now with Michael Pillsbury's book. I have an idea. I'm going to buy 100 copies of this book, and you sign it. I'm going to send to these people who can provide endorsement. Send it to the White House and Capitol Hill. Thank you, sir.
You're on.
Can I just mention one thing, funny what Sarah's talking about? There's 12 recommendations in here. Anybody who gets to the last chapter. Recommendation number 5, I call find common ground at home. We have a lot of different committees in the Congress that each one deals with a part of the China problem. But there is no overall law. There's no China Policy Act. There's nothing above foreign relations, armed services, finance, commerce, technology control. There's no overall China Policy Act. Only fairly recently.
I'm trying to figure out who will be first in line to kill.
It would have to be shaped by the usual compromise. But just to have common sense things. Our goal is democracy in China someday. We've never even passed that as a law. Our goal is to restrict high-tech technology transfers to China that compromise national security. Even basic principles have never been committed to law and passed. So what still stands, close readers of the book will notice, what still stands is what's sometimes called the Oxenberg policy. President Jimmy Carter ordered, and I couldn't get a copy for the book, this has gone through security review, I tried to get this one document, where President Carter orders every department of government to form a joint commission with China and to help its Chinese counterpart, help Chinese productivity, help everything in China. National Science Foundation, transfer all American scientific discoveries to China immediately with an office in Beijing. None of this is authorized by Congress. It happens because the Congress is passive. It doesn't intervene. And as I say, there's not even an inventory. So when you talk about how the book is helpful, and